This is my grandmother, Sylvia Gray. She ran a store in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina from 1939 until 1997. As kids, it was a magical, magical place. I'd come up from Atlanta and visit my cousins, my aunts, and my uncles, and my favorite part was going downtown to South Elm and staying in the store all day, digging, looking around, searching through boxes. We were told we could take anything we wanted, but as a kid, I much preferred finding things and hiding them again so that I could find them on the next trip. The store comes out of a relatively ordinary but sort of extraordinary history of American culture and surplus. In the 1930s, my grandfather, Joe, and my grandmother began sending new North Carolina furniture to New York, and they realized that the trucks, canvas trucks at the time, were coming back empty. So they started to fill them with repossessed Depression-era surplus taken from stock houses in New York. And then over time, the business changed, and they found a depot in Greensboro that was selling Army surplus in the 40s. It began purchasing pup tents and hammocks and combat boots and all sorts of different things and reselling them in a catalog company to Boy Scout troops around the country, even hospitals. The business was booming, my family was growing, and then in 1955, my grandfather had a sudden heart attack and passed away, leaving my grandmother with 3 kids, my mom and her 2 brothers. We're not really sure what happened in the aftermath. We think that maybe there's some evidence that she transitioned from workwear into women's wear, buying clothes, hats, gloves, furs. And eventually, she started to get the ends of fabric bolts from the local mills, ends of ribbon cuttings, books, toys, objects, knickknacks. She amassed a vast, vast quantity of stuff, filling all 3 floors of her space. It's said that if she liked you, it would have been cheap, and if she didn't like you, she wouldn't sell to you. If you tried to barter with her, she would raise the price and eventually kick you out. If she thought you were stealing from her, she would lock you in. She would shop at the Salvation Army that was right down the street twice a day. It's even said that there was little old ladies who would follow behind her and pick up the things that she left behind. For my part, it was a magical, magical place. People come in all the time and they say, is she a hoarder? And I think that with the fascination and the fashion of these new television shows, we like to focus on the spectacle of an individual illness, when it's really a much larger issue. My uncles would say she was a shrewd businesswoman, she knew exactly what her things were worth, and she wasn't willing to sell it for 1 cent less. My mom tends to think that she bought all of this for the grandkids, which I don't think is really true. And for my part, I kind of tend to believe that she grew up in an era of the Depression, where people knew the meaning of things, and they valued what they had, and they knew how to use what was at hand. So, after she passed in '97, the store was locked, left without destination. 6 years later, I'm coming into my senior year at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a political communications major, actually, but was fascinated with fiction. And I was interested in the way that I could use fiction to tell histories of my own that were perhaps closer to the truth. And I met a wonderful friend and collaborator, Stephanie, and she and I kind of developed this project called collaborative fiction. And the idea was simple. We looked around at our community at Penn and didn't feel like the academics and the writers and the artists were all coming together, and we were curious about how language could help divide or fix that gap. And we'd go into public spaces like 30th Street Station or into West Philly, and we would write these little character sketches of people we saw and then try to merge these characters into the same story. And this was before Wikipedia, certainly before Google Docs. We were literally passing the computers back and forth among a group of maybe 6 or 10 of us, writing these characters and trying to understand how it is that the house dad in his home with his domestic questions and the astronaut in her spaceship could live onto the same page. And that spring break, I took a trip down with Steph to Greensboro, and I said, Steph, you gotta check out my grandmother's old store. It's been locked up for 6 years, come take a look. It was all very normal to me. I kind of didn't think about it as strange. And sometimes it takes a little something from the outside to spark that, and that's what sort of Steph did. She walked in and was blown away. And I said, no, let's just take a box of things back. And we took a box of things back to Philly. And it changed everything. The things changed everything. Suddenly the group, collaborative fiction group, was putting on clothes and wearing hats. We were acting more and more like the characters in our story. The characters in our story were seeming more and more like reality, closer to us. And we began to wonder, what if we could do this on a larger scale, a much bigger scale? What if we could turn the entire store into a collaborative fiction? If we could invite artists and writers and musicians to come in and cross boundaries, cross disciplines, using the resources of stuff as their material. And so we moved down to Greensboro and moved into the store and began living inside of a thrift store, which was fun. There wasn't really a clear plan, to be honest with you. Everyone thought we were going to be out in 6 months. But we just started organizing and sifting and shifting and moving things around. And it actually all happened again in kind of an ordinary fashion. The artists needed a studio, the writers needed a library, the fabric artists needed their textiles available to them, and everyone needed a kitchen. And so eventually we had, of course, all the dishware and everything was already there, which is great. The hardest work was bringing the stoves down from the 3rd floor so we could have some counter space. And we began piecing it together, and eventually we ran out of friends to invite down. And so we put a call online and said, artists interested in coming and working in the store and creating things, and those things will remain here and they'll become available for transformation. We laid it all out, and suddenly people from Vancouver and New York and San Francisco and LA and New Mexico and Jakarta were coming to Greensboro, North Carolina to make things with the stuff there. It was a magical, as I said, a magical experience. And we began to wonder how we could make this work. A store where nothing's for sale doesn't mean anything to anyone. Okay. The idea that you would picture this: Greensboro is filled with antique shoppers, right, and antique stores, and people are walking in and they want to buy things we're not selling to them. It's not great PR. On top of it, the artists are coming in and they don't know why they can't just tear things apart and make things that they want to make. And why are we being so precious with this stuff? And it doesn't exactly click. And how do you describe that, words and objects are so close, and that if you could arrange and rearrange the things that you had available, if you could care for them, almost like a natural resource, you could come to discover that there are myriad stories laying potentially within each of these things, and that actually creativity and creation with the stuff should be positioned towards the future that others can respond to and grow from what one makes, not that it sits there on a pedestal like most pieces of art. So the solution was the museum. In a museum, nothing's for sale, but there's something to see. In a museum, you're working with a collection. You're tending to a collection. You're caring for a collection. And in this case, artists were getting to explore within that collection. In a museum, audiences come to watch artists in practice. And artists get to practice with audiences. It's kind of like a Wunderkammer, right? A Wunderkammer was the original museum, the Cabinets of Wonder, where the princes would collect all of the treasures of the world and they would amass them in this chaotic order, and people would walk in and find their own symbolic meanings and values among all the things that were there. Now, of course, Duchamp had also put a urinal in a museum, so anything could be art, and my grandmother's store might be able to be high art. And Warhol had famously said that every museum will be a department store, and every department store will be a museum. And so in some cases, we are filling out a bit of history there. Thank you, Andy. So people come into the museum and they see things that they had not imagined. They see things that they had remembered as children. They are beside themselves in this strange way. And so we called it Elsewhere. But we still didn't quite know what Elsewhere was. And so the notion of the living museum began to emerge, this idea that it was this place that was changing and growing and shaping around the responses of artists, and that the living museum would be rather than like in Williamsburg, where you have living museums and people live in a historical moment. Here, we live in a contemporary moment surrounded by things. And we began to shape our residency program for the artists. Most residencies invite you to propose a work that you want to do. Rather, let me say this, most artists imagine a work that they want to do, and they go out and they find the things and they make it, and they make that work. But elsewhere, it's a little different. We actually explicitly do not want proposals. We take artists in, we ask them questions like, how did you play as a child? What are the spaces, real and imaginary, in which your work exists? What's your experience with collections? Because we want them to come in and search and find and discover that thing, and in imagining what they're thinking, along the way find a million other things, literal and material things, that lead their work into different ways. And that way, a combination and communication between different practices can start to emerge. And over this time, of course, the process of ordering, this is another story for another time, but the process of ordering things is also kind of similar to ordering an organization and developing a staff, and developing a nonprofit, and developing a community around you. So I had this really wonderful experience recently. It was actually at a workshop on media advocacy and activism. And someone who was there said to me, you know, I can really come to the table as my full self. And I thought, how odd, how exciting, that in the midst of all of these things, in a room filled with contemporary artworks as important and valuable as the thrift tables and the thrift plates we were eating at, that someone could come into this space with strangers, people from far away, artists from other countries, neighbors that they had never met, neighbors that they were close to, museum visitors peering in and looking at us like we were a performance, even though it was just dinner, and feel at home. And I think this is what place does, and what a place like Elsewhere helps bring forward. It makes place a kind of where you're familiar, even though everything's different, and especially because everything is different, because then there's something to learn and share. Elsewhere allows you to be curious and ask questions and to be surprised. Our cities are losing this. We're losing our sense of place. We're rehabbing, we're prefabbing everything because it's cost effective. Our public spaces are becoming increasingly more corporatized, and it's not so much the problem that there's something for sale on every corner, but the problem is that the brands aim to be exclusive and not inclusive. We tend to see things as derelict, and therefore we demolish and we develop, we don't evolve. We price out, we don't invest. And so a place like Elsewhere reminds us to be curious, to ask questions, to be open, to be engaged, that art is participatory. It reminds us that we should be surprised and to value surprise in our communities. And perhaps it even says something about mixed use, which is it's not just a classification for zoning, but actually the way we experience our everyday lives all the time. So I like to close with these guys, which was the first lesson I ever learned at Elsewhere. And this is after years of searching and finding and pulling down. We found, there's only pictured I think 8 here, but all 12 Fisher-Price phones. And we had brought them down. Some had been sitting for years, 40 years maybe, who knows? 40 years in the darkest corners, some in the light in the front window. And yet each of their expressions over time had worn differently. Their sounds, their ringtones had changed ever so slightly, and yet they seem more like the thing we remember as children. And it's a reminder that in some ways, despite our best efforts, place grows tenaciously. It fights to be there, and if we take notice of what we have, and what things have become, and we look to those things, we build upon them, we integrate with them, we expand upon them, then in this excitement, Elsewhere ceases to be just one place, but everywhere. Thank you.